Hi, welcome. So I'm glad you're all here. And the important thing to know is I've definitely not been on the road since 10 in the morning cleaning out my mom's cabin that she's selling and then getting here 8 minutes ago. Absolutely not. Um, but what I would like to do, I first have a question, which is one of the things I've tried to do is merge the courses. So I see that there are 34 of us, which is great. I want to ask, are any of us in the 645 section?
I am.
Okay, yes, excellent. So that means that you were able to download the slides, see the syllabus. Okay, good. So that's good. Um, it makes it a little bit harder for me to send out stuff for the 645 students, but it makes it better for the class. I'll use email. Um, okay. The next thing I'm going to try to do is I'm actually going to try to share my open PowerPoint because this lecture has some videos that I'd like to play, and it'll be easier that way. If that doesn't work, I'll do what I used to usually do with Collaborate, which is just use the PDF file that has the slides, and we'll figure out a different way to watch videos. But here we go. I'm going to share an application screen, and whoa! Um, that is looking profound, but that is not the application that I'm trying to share. So let's stop that. And I'm going to give one more try. Let's see. Let's see what happens when I share this one. Nope. Okay. Um, if this is working, you should see a honeybee on a flower and just the introduction,
I see it.
the opening slide saying culture and evolution. I'm going to end this show, go back into and now I'm going to ask whether you were able to see that. Okay, so you saw the slide. Okay, so it's going to take me a second. I'm going to go back into PowerPoint, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say send. Okay. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Great. So to start, it's a little bit of nuts and bolts. I am Mitchell Baker. My degree is in animal behavior, but I mostly study how insect behaviors affect how quickly they evolve resistance to insecticides and agroecology in general. This semester, it doesn't really matter where my office is, even though I do hope to be on campus about 3 days a week. My office hours are going to be Tuesdays 10 a.m. to 12 noon and Thursdays 12 to 2 p.m. And because I am a bad person, I haven't posted the Zoom link for my office hours here, which saddens me. I'm writing down a note to myself to post that link to Blackboard, and the office will also have that Zoom link. So the course is kind of simple, and I noticed the first error, which is that there are going to be 3 evaluatory exercises. There is a midterm and a final, but there also will be a quiz after the heritability lecture, because heritability is a concept that kind of breaks our brains. And so I want to have a little quiz on it so that it doesn't count for too many points, and also so that you will be able to, so that you'll be able to get some quick feedback. So there's a midterm and a final plus 1 quiz on heritability concepts.
Professor, I have a question.
Okay, there is also a paper. It's about 4 to 6 pages long, not counting the bibliography. It can either be a simple review, or you can structure it as a research proposal. And we're going to have a prospectus due.
I think you have to type it. I'm not sure you can
remember around week 8, because I'm a bad person. I have the syllabus as a file on a screen that I don't dare access because I'm sharing the PowerPoint. However, there'll also be some worksheets. We'll be doing breakout groups to be doing some activities during even remote lecture. I'm just going to mention right now that there are, you know what? I'm gonna stop sharing this because I'm going to stop sharing. Instead, I'm going to share just the visual slides, and then I'm going to switch over to sharing the PowerPoint to show some videos. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because the one really good thing about doing these virtual lectures is that we can use chat and actually interact and answer questions. So someone asked a very good question, which said, first quiz and heritability quiz. Yeah, I'm going to go with the syllabus because having more frequent evaluations is actually good, because then they all take fewer points. So in the 3rd class, we'll have a really quick quiz, mostly so that you can get a sense for how I ask questions. We will follow that up immediately with a quiz just on heritability. We'll have a midterm during class that will be, I actually have not fully decided how I'm going to do the midterm, because sometimes in this sort of distance learning virtual thing, what I like to do is just give you essay questions to work on. But I haven't yet decided the format for the midterm. And then we'll have a final. Okay, so I'm just going to write this in the chat, because that sometimes it might be easier to see things saved in the chat. And the heritability quiz is going to take about 10 minutes. right? So it's not like a big deal, but I do want that sort of instant feedback on um, on those concepts. Okay. Um, oh, I do want to give you some advice, however, and also talk about the readings. Um, so as you, hopefully, if you've looked at the syllabus, you've seen that I put down 3 texts, and um, those texts are supposed to be, I'm so sorry, Collaborate has changed enough that it's being a little bit cagey about where it's going to put its pen. And I, let's see, if I do this, I should have a pen. Yes, okay, fine, I have a pen. Yay. So sorry. Let's make this a little bit of a thinner line. So as you, if you hopefully saw, there are 3 texts, right? And they're all required for the course. One is like the best-selling popular science book ever, oddly enough, although it might have been replaced by A Brief History of Time, but it might be this one. So that's called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. Very influential, quite well written. Um, I'm going to be kind of arguing against it most of this course, just as a little preview. Um, so I think it's both very smart and often careful in how it phrases things, and also fundamentally wrong. It's also a great quick read, and you can find it in your local library. If you're having also for $1 plus shipping, on the interwebs, and any version is fine. I don't really care which one you get. They had like a 20th anniversary, um, it doesn't change that much. The second 2 are Not by Genes Alone, and this is by Richardson and Boyd. All of this is in the syllabus, but I want to kind of talk about each of these. This is the hardest text in the course. It's going to be somewhat dense and kind of assumes a decent background knowledge on evolution, which I'm going to be trying to give in the course. Um, and then the third book is actually surprisingly easy reading because his primary literature, are not. He develops often very complex models to develop arguments that then can be expressed after the fact quite simply. But the third book is The Secret of Our Success by Joe Henrich. So, Secret of Our Success. And so this is a fairly new book. It's going to be harder to get used, but it's a regular paperback. It's about 15. Um, the reason why I go over the readings with you, um, even though, hopefully you have the books already, is, I've got a bunch of topics I'm going to talk about, and I have readings for each week, and I pick out the things that kind of match. But this course takes an oddly long time to get started. In other words, I'm going to talk about what we're going to be covering, because there's kind of 2 parts. One is how are traits passed along in ways other than by genes, and that probably deals more with animals even than humans. And then the other part is how do how does selection act on behavior in groups versus individuals, and then also, how do human cultures evolve, and basically the fundamental questions we're asking are like, does altruism exist? Why do humans cooperate in ways that um, animals and plants don't? Um, and you're free to write a paper on any of those topics. But my advice to you is, especially if you're interested in human behavior, um, don't wait for the course to give you ideas for paper topics. Just read this book like a book, from start to finish. I mean, you can skip boring stuff, but read through that whole book. And if you're interested in sort of human cultural evolution, it will give you questions, especially if you read it in a questioning way. Like, write down questions as you're reading it, follow the footnotes for things that you're interested in, use that as a gateway to see, oh, what's the primary literature that he's referring to? And that will give you some good ideas for paper topics. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble choosing topics that, you're going to have trouble choosing interesting topics based on the first 3 lectures. That's my take home. So my recommendation is, um, you know, blast through the Henrik book, because it will give you ideas. Okay, so evolution and culture. Um, it is an oddly fascinating topic. Definitely, if you not Google, but if you search evolution and culture, the last time I did that, there were 10,000 books at Amazon, using the words evolution and culture, versus 737 books for hunger and poverty. So take that, hunger and poverty. Oddly enough, this time there were about 10,000 for entomology and 10,000 for animal behavior, which is really surprising. The time before, there were like 2.5 times as many evolution and culture than entomology and animal behavior. They've changed how they do their searches. But in any event, lots of people seem interested in it. Um, Partly because there's the whole idea of how traits are passed on culturally as an alternative to genetically is, gets at this sort of fundamental question of like nature versus nurture. Nature versus nurture is shorthand for, is our behavior or the behavior of animals, whatever you're studying, other animals, whatever you're studying, um, determined by genes versus shaped by learning in the environment, which is an argument that like predates any understanding of genetics and has to do with like, you know, our early feelings of helplessness in the world and thinking whether our own like lives were determined by fate, um, versus whether we have some sense of free will. And you get that like in every mythology. It's just an obvious question that people have, and you get that in early thinking about natural history, what became biology. We'll be talking about this idea a little bit more, but I don't need to um, read my mind. I don't need to like use a word without um, defining it. Orthogenesis is the idea of sort of goal oriented, or sort of directed, or even directional evolutionary change. Um, and of course, the history of like thinking about and studying um, differences, the whether behavioral differences are caused by environment and culture versus genes, or sort of fundamental nature, um, has been, you know the place where we see scientists expressing whatever racist ideologies that shaped their thinking in scientific terms. So we'll be talking a little bit about how, in the heritability lecture, we'll also be talking about a little bit about history of eugenics in the US and in Europe. So apparently endlessly fascinating topic for most of us, but one of the course goals is to get us to hopefully a level of understanding that there is no easily separatable nature and culture, right? You can't actually separate genes from the environment, because even when genes are shaping traits or affecting traits, they do it within a given environment. They do it by interacting with an environment, and you can't actually separate genes from the environment. Okay, so course goals. One is a modern understanding of how culture and environment interact with genetic and other inheritance mechanisms to form behavioral traits. So one of the really great things about the Henrik book is his arguments about how cultural transmission is an evolutionary force, sort of both on its own, and also how culturally evolved and selected traits feed back and lead to genetic evolution. I also want us to understand what is now called multi-level selection theory. So there has been debates in evolutionary biology on what level of organization selection acts on. Does it select on individuals' bodies? Does it act on genes? Does it act on perhaps groups or species, or larger phylogenetic levels of organization? And so we'll be spending a good deal of time on that. In terms of the course readings, Dawkins spends the most time arguing, oddly enough, for selection operating on the level of individuals, not genes or groups, but then he calls it the selfish gene, which is inherently confusing. But Dawkins is going to argue very effectively for individual level selection. And so I'm going to be giving us background on multi-level selection theory. Those will be the readings by David Sloan Wilson, Sober, and Wilson. I also want us to understand heritability because it gets sort of misused and misdescribed. It's a somewhat slippery topic. And so that's actually kind of a course goal, and that's why we'll even have a little quiz on it, to reinforce it. As in all my courses, we have a little writing, and so another course goal is for us to all write with topic sentences, because they are awesome. For us to cite and use and find outside sources properly and effectively. And also practice breaking our teeth on primary literature. And so we'll be spending some time in class going over all of those skills. We actually do some of that in 106, and there's always only somewhat moderate success. So we have another crack at it, and we'll do it even better here. Okay, so I talk about this in almost every course, and I feel terrible because some of you don't have any problem with this, but I also firmly believe that like using outside sources properly and stuff is totally a learned skill. So I'll talk a little bit about how to use outside sources here, and then later we can spend more time on the fun things like finding articles and puzzling out what they could possibly mean. So in the academic world, you know, we don't have you can have every kind of crime in an academic setting, and those would all be awful. But in the benign world where we're not suffering from other kinds of like violent crime, stealing ideas is, you know, it's about as bad as it gets in academia. Um, so play the one frustrating thing for me about plagiarism is that I would actually be happiest if like we caught every instance of plagiarism and like instantly gave you some feedback and took off 10 points. And unfortunately, like, I don't know, some years we catch a lot, some years we don't, you know, we miss it, and the penalties are sometimes huge. So I will, you know, tell you now that if you clearly misuse sources, um, then I'll then it'll be a 0 for that assignment, and I'll probably send a list of people, hopefully a list of no one, um, to the um, to the academic affairs office. But here's the thing. I think all of us know, well, all of us definitely know that if you were just copy a Wikipedia article or a chunk of it and stick it in the paper and not cite Wikipedia, that's like plagiarism. And I think also most of us know, but not all of us, so I'm going to just mention it, that plagiarism also includes quoting chunks of text, um, but not making it clear that it's a quote. And that happens even if that source is cited, right? So, and this can happen, I will say, sometimes out of, I don't know, like honest fear, like this idea that like maybe I'm not going to summarize or describe this source the right way, so I'm going to try to go as close to its words as possible. Um, and, you know, how do I say this? Don't think that way. Like the whole idea of these assignments is to find some hard text to chew on and then do your best attempt to like explain it to your grandmother in a completely different way than the author explained it, and cite them because you're using their ideas, right? But if you're using a quote, it has to be in quotation marks, right? And so even if you have the citation in the paragraph, if there's no quotation marks, that's saying something very specific to the reader. That's saying, I read this source and I'm giving you my interpretation and explanation in my own words. Because if I was using their words, I'd put it in a quote. And so for the you know, the best, how do we say this, grade, um, there actually shouldn't be quotes in most of our papers, because I think I do this spiel a lot of times. You know, you use quotes either because the wording is like poetic and lyrical and beautiful, and none of the papers we're reading are like that. There are only like two quotes that show up in biology papers, and one is Dobzhansky, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. See, I should have been reading the quote because, you know, the exact words are good. And then like the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, where he's looking at a river bank, and it's like full of like all sorts of plants and animals with complex interactions and stuff. And it's like, I look at this tangled bank and think there is, wonder in this view of life, that all of this complexity and exquisite adaptation could have been caused by evolution, by natural selection, accumulation of small change over time. So actually, he said it much better, and that quote keeps up. Okay, so I have fun looking up this section every time I teach this course and do this talk, because there's always some high power nominee for a cabinet position that ends up having copied parts of their thesis or an article or a book without attribution. So this is from 2014. This was, it wasn't a, I think I forget if there had been a death or a retirement, or like a senator had joined Obama's cabinet and the governor appointed John Walsh to be the interim senator. But then it turns out that for his like final paper at I think it was a military academy, he'd quoted from sources without quotation marks, even though most of the sources were in the bibliography. This happens frequently. So you're thinking about more recent administrations. So Monica Crowley was nominated to a Treasury position, or actually no, a national security position. And then it turned out that she plagiarized sections in her PhD dissertation, and then much more in a book in 2012. Oddly enough, her nomination was withdrawn, but she was nominated to a position in Treasury because there you go. And our current president is one of the oldest presidents ever, right? And why is that the case? He actually I think was our youngest senator in like 1970 something, and was on the fast track. But in the 1988 presidential election, so the primaries in 1987, there was a British politician, Neil Kinnock, who'd given this really inspirational speech that Biden loved. And in the beginning, he used to quote it with attribution. He'd say, like, as Neil Kinnock said. And then over time, he just stopped doing the attribution. And the controversy over that caused him to lose the Democratic nomination, because at that time this was considered a more serious offense. And so there you go. I'm actually not sure now if I've shown you that plagiarism is something that can dog you in life and is taken seriously, or that successful people plagiarized. You should learn the first lesson. Anyway, there you go. It's an avoidable error. That's my take home, right? It's an avoidable error that, depending on context, can really do some damage, and it's a really avoidable error. That's what I'll say. Okay, so two major questions that we're going to be addressing in this course. One, how does culture affect evolution? In other words, how are traits transmitted? First, how are they transmitted genetically, environmentally, or culturally, and also through other non-genetic inheritance mechanisms, because there's been a lot of research on epigenetic inheritance. We have one professor, Sebastian Alvarado, that's what he's studying. And then the other part of the course is how do traits evolve in cultures or groups? And some of that is the levels of selection question, which I asked about before, and we're going to um, watch a video at the end where Dawkins lays out his argument. But it's also what selfish or altruistic traits are favored in groups. Because interestingly, we usually think of groups as and a lot of evolutionary biologists have thought of groups as places, contexts where cooperation is required for groups to function well. Like, and groups are going to be vulnerable to cheaters, and that's a big problem. But the other thing is that groups are the only social environments where you have an opportunity to cheat other individuals, right? Solitary organisms never have the chance to try to take advantage of another individual. And so actually, in some ways, groups favor selfish behavior. It provides an opportunity for selfishness that you wouldn't get outside of social groups. So we'll be talking about both of these. Culture can be defined in a number of different ways. I'm going to use the Richardson and Boyd definition for the course. So their definition is, and their goal in this definition mostly is to distinguish culture from other kinds of environmental effects, because some environmental effects are incredibly important, but also, I don't know, sort of different on a different dimension. I mean, temperature and food availability are environmental effects that have huge developmental effects on individuals and even affect behavior, but they're not culture. So Richardson and Boyd have culture as information capable of affecting individuals' behavior. And it's not just any kind of information, because you can talk about inadvertent social learning in birds. We'll talk about that. There are things like there's amazing experiments that have been done in cavity nesting birds, like pied flycatchers, where they'll peek into other birds' nests and see how many chicks there are, and they'll use that to as a rough estimate of habitat quality, and the brood sizes in the nest box in an area will have a big effect on how many young birds like to settle in that area the following spring. But that's not culture. It's not being acquired through other members of their species through sort of cultural learning mechanisms, teaching, imitation, sort of social transmission. And in some ways, the word that's missing here is sort of intentional, and that's partly because animals don't have conscious intentions in the way that humans do. But it cultural transmission mechanisms are in some ways they're how do I say this? Well, they're kind of intentional. So there you go. So we're going to be talking about many of these. We'll talk about teaching, we'll talk about imitation, imitation in humans, how it differs from other primates. We'll talk about song learning and other forms of social transmission, prestige bias, sort of things that moderate or modify imitation, teaching, and learning. One example of sort of a cultural difference, sort of a classic, is and it's not actually, in some ways it's not a great example because it's hard to prove and it's still, kind of just on the level of a really good theory. But it does show sort of interesting ways in which sort of cultures can differ. And this is the subject of, I guess, culture of honor in southern US states. So if you look at homicide rates in the US, they are higher in southern states than the national average. And that's controlling for some things like population size. Between 1865 and 1915, they were 10 times the national average and twice the rate of the most violent cities during that time. It seems to have moderated some. Between 1976 and 2003, it was significantly higher, but not as dramatically higher than the national average for violent crime. And this is a hypothesis that was put forward by social scientists Nisbet and Cohn, and they wrote a book about it in 1996. And the way they're defining culture and honor is that in societies that are lacking in sort of effective state protection, like high density with good non-corrupt police, people have to basically defend themselves more. So the idea is to maintain credible power of deterrence of violence from others. The individual must project a stance of willingness to commit mayhem and to risk wounds or death for himself. Thus, he must constantly be on guard against affronts that could be construed by others as disrespect. When someone allows himself to be insulted, he risks giving the impression that he lacks the ability to protect what is his. Thus, the individual must respond with violence or the threat of violence to every affront. There's an interesting parallel between this and the display behaviors in stomatopod snapping shrimp, but I didn't make slides for that, so we'll let that go until a little bit later. And Nisbet and Cohn are, as described in the Richardson-Boyd, we're arguing that there was a more developed culture of honor in southern states because they were settled, and this is just looking at early US settlement by Europeans. Southern states were settled by people from lower density herding regions at Scotland and Ireland, as opposed to English and Dutch German peasant farmers who settled more in the north, who had grown up in non-herding, more settled agricultural areas where basically people didn't have to guard and maintain sort of borders over large areas. So the idea is that sparse population in the South, also in the US, the population was less dense, which meant that people were less able to rely on police for defense of life and property, which encourages this culture of deterrence. So there are alternative explanations for differences in murder rates, and so a significant part of the book is arguing against either structural explanations, so local differences in wealth or just population density, or temperature, or economic inequality, which is different than like average wealth. And these are all factors that have effects on violent crime, significant effects. One of the interesting ones is temperature. There's a well-established literature that murder rates go up during hotter times of the year, which has been applied, somewhat speculatively to talk about higher murder rates expected due to climate change, which is probably true, but it's still sort of like there's lots of other stuff that will be happening as well. Um, However, if you have sort of large sample size, many years, many locations, you can try to measure and control for those effects and see if there's still a north-south difference, controlling for average income, inequality of income, temperature, and population density. And so, a large chunk of their book is looking at the correlations and trying to factor out those and finding that there's still arguing at least that there's still a difference. Um, Another possibility are genetic differences, which hopefully by the time we get to the heritability and eugenics lecture, we'll be able to deal with a little bit better. But there's no evidence for. So evidence in favor of this culture of honor is that you would expect all kinds of murder rates to be higher in poorer areas than wealthier areas, if or if either poverty or inequality or temperature was the cause of the difference in homicide rates. And what they found was actually that only some kinds of homicide rates were higher and not others. So argument homicide rates were higher. These are murders that start off as a disagreement or an argument that then escalate to violence and sometimes killing. And one thing so this is this is from Hayes 2006. So this is looking at average rates of homicides and per 100,000 people, and it's looking at Confederate versus non-Confederate states, so North versus South. Let's just make that. So Confederate. And they split it out into felony-based. So this is a homicide that's happening in the course of a robbery or another serious crime, and then argument-based homicides. And what you can see is that the difference for felony-based homicides per 100,000 people is 2.7 versus 2. Standard deviation 2.45, 2.46, or 1.7. So there's a lot of overlap. If you look at the argument-based homicide rate, it's almost twice as high rather than 1 1/3 times as high. But there's still a fairly wide range of overlap between these two estimates. But actually, like this is standard deviation, which is going to be larger than standard error. So the difference in argument-based homicides is much greater between North and South than the felony-based homicide difference. So it's kind of suggestive. This difference is consistent if culture of honor differences is leading to differences in murder rates versus things like temperature or poverty. So then the other thing that you learn is most of what we know about human behavior, tragically, is done on psych studies of, undergraduate North American undergrads. So that's, if you take 230, if any of you have taken Bio 230 biostats, you learn about what's called the sample of convenience. So there you go. So a lot of studies are based on, questionnaires and and sometimes really clever and nice experiments, but it's done on undergrads. So that means that like it's less um, it's less diverse economically, racially, and certainly in terms of age. In this case, I don't know, it might not be the worst thing because at least it's focusing on young people who are more likely to um, engage in risky, violent behavior. So there's a bit of a focus. Although everyone probably at University of Michigan, where this study was done, is pretty comfortable. So it was a really cool study. Um, the students were recruited for some psych study, maybe a real one, because a lot of times you combine many studies into one. But the treatment was actually, the experiment was actually how they um, was actually like an experience that they had while they thought they were waiting online to go into the study. Um, so there was a pre-treatment. Um, the treatment individuals received a bump and an epithet. So, that means that someone walked by while they were waiting online, bumped them, and then muttered something like asshole, something like that. And then the response, so that was the treatment. Some people got a bump with a little epithet, and some people didn't get a bump. And then the response was a really big football player um, would be recruited, an actor, to basically approach the subject. And so what was interesting was when approached by a big guy, um, before the bump and epithet, or the control, the ones that never got a bump and an epithet, there was a significant difference between University of Michigan students from Confederate states versus northern states. And the Southerners would step aside earlier at 9 feet, um, whereas the control Northerners step aside at 6 feet. And the interesting thing is the experimental Northerners also step aside at 6 feet. In other words, they were not affected by having been bumped with an epithet. You could also say that Northerners are more used to bumping into people and weirdness in subways, but actually the North is a lot, and New York is fairly unique in having that crowded a public transportation system. Well, maybe Chicago. Um, Experimental Southerners stepped aside at 3 feet. In other words, the Southerners who'd gotten that little bump and curse out were now like geared up to fight. That was the interpretation, that they weren't going to stand aside for someone else after they'd gotten riled up. And then they also did follow-up studies where, they took blood tests right after the experiment, and experimental Southerners had more elevated stress hormones, cortisol and testosterone. So again, you know, it's a kind of contrived study, and it's on a very non-representative sample, but it's a cool result, and it is consistent with the hypothesis. Okay, so that's just one example of cultural variation in humans. One of the really nice things that's in both Richardson and Boyd and the Henrik book, and it's better in the Henrik book, so you should definitely read it. It's in some of the early chapters, but I forget if it's like 2, 3, or 4, is they do a great job. He does a great job of um, unpacking how much knowledge is embedded in different cultures. And the examples that are being developed in the book, and I'll talk about them some later in the course, are how much knowledge is needed to survive comfortably, stress-free in Arctic environments. Um, And I mean, and it's really interesting that it's really interesting because different societies and cultures that have lived um, in Arctic environments um, are living in low density and sometimes have become isolated and lost some of that cultural knowledge that allowed them to, you know, to have a whole range of skills, different kinds of harpoons, different kinds of boat building. Um, and anyway, that's another really good example that's early in the Henrik book. Um, Animal cultures are much simpler. They are real. Some of them have been studied, in great detail, especially um, song learning and songbirds. Um, and we'll have a whole or half a lecture on that. Um, but the kinds of information are the use of culture is much more limited. So one example are the geographic dialects in songbirds. So one this is I mean, a lot of people really love birds. So we have records for some species like song sparrows and white-crowned sparrows going back decades, like some to the 1930s, documenting local dialects, consistent geographic variation in song within species. And it's really interesting because the boundaries are sometimes consistent over many decades. Interestingly, and it will go into this when we talk about song learning, the dialects are not caused by, nor are they correlated with genetic differences among the populations that have differences in song. However, they still last for a long time. So they're culturally transmitted. And immigrants from one dialect neighborhood to another dialect neighborhood will fit into the new neighborhood by producing the song that is locally appropriate. And then these songs are used for both defending territories against other males and also attracting females. And so these songs are very important for reproductive success and fitness. Um, so yeah, I mean, we're gonna talk we're gonna talk a lot about birdsong. Um, but one of the interesting things is that so Professor Lati has students studying dialects, continuing a project by Paul Mundinger on house finches. The earliest work on song dialects was by, I think, Margaret Nice in 1930s. I think she was describing song sparrow or white-crowned sparrow dialect definitely in California. I forget if it's like the Berkeley area or more Southern California, like Los Angeles or Riverside. So these dialects have first been studied in cities, although now the entire West Coast, California to Washington, have been mapped for especially those focal species, song sparrows and white-crowned sparrows. Oh, temporary stable. So it's not temporary. This is great using the chat. Hopefully will remember to look. It's not temporary, it's temporally in time. The so when Margaret Nice studied studied, I think it was Berkeley, she studied neighborhoods and, you know, let's say this is going to be terrible, but let's say this is um, San Francisco, and this is Berkeley, and this is Oakland. Don't ever Oakland, and let's say this is one dialogue zone in 1935, and then this is another one where they use, you know, they don't have a trill, they just have a whistle. And then this is another dialect area. Um, when Gordon Orions went out, so you had these three dialect neighborhoods in 1935 when they were studied by Margaret Nice, and then when I think it was Gordon Orions went and did recordings and mapped those neighborhoods, they'd stayed stable roughly over those times. There were still three dialects in the same area. So we're going to talk about that in much more detail because the dialects do sometimes change over time, but they are also good examples of them being very stable over time. And interestingly, the differences between those dialects over those decades maintained completely culturally, not by any genetic mechanism. Okay. Um, what I'm gonna do, let's see. I'm going to, let's see. Um, Con! Let me see if I have this video where it's supposed to be. So unbeknownst to you, I'm zipping over to the PowerPoint version of this, where sadly I didn't have the, so you know what? Rather than making you wait, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to find this video and have it queued up for us to watch because some of the others are already embedded in the PowerPoint. They're ready to go. This one is hiding from me right now. So I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to take a 5-minute break and let's get back at 7:55. Okay?